Hello and welcome to another A-level lesson, this time in the influence of public schools on sport. So a reminder of these lessons, the yellow text boxes refer to the tasks for the students, the green text boxes are the note-taking sections for students, the blue text boxes are differentiation tasks, and the red text boxes are the teaching and learning strategies and ideas for the practitioner. So in regards to the syllabus, students, what you need to be able to know in regards to this topic is have an understanding of the influence of public schools and how they promoted sport and games during this post-industrial period, so between the 18 and 1900s. You also need to be aware of the philosophy, the ethics behind sport during this period, and especially within the public school sector. You then need to be able to be aware of this key term of cult of athleticism, okay, and be able to understand the impacts of this cult. And finally, recognize obviously the public schoolboys, how they spread and exported sport globally. So let's get cracking with today's lesson. So when we think of public schools, first and foremost, we're talking about schools that were specifically set up and made for the middle and upper class boys to attend between the 18 and 1900s, okay, specifically for the syllabus. So ultimately it was for the gentry class, okay, and this new class which was referred to as the middle class, which had some disposable income. Some examples of public schools would have been things like Eton, Harrow and Rugby School. They were the three kind of main public schools within England at that period of time. And ultimately, these schools had lots of money from tuition fees. So ultimately, with all of that money, they were able to invest in lots of new facilities, lavish facilities, and extensive facilities. And you can see from that picture there on the right-hand side, we've got grand buildings, we'll have big playing fields, okay, and these schools would have really had extensive kind of sporting facilities, and they heavily promoted sport, and we'll see why that was the case. So first task, I want you just to pause your video here. I want you to create this question as a spider diagram. So what were the main characteristics of public schools? Have a look if you can find any clues in that picture. Okay, so when we think of the characteristics of public schools, okay, we can look at a few things here. The first is that it was male only, okay, a lot of these public schools. And ultimately that still existed because it was still seen that women predominantly should be housewives, okay, and the males were the ones that should be going out to get the extensive jobs, and that meant that they would be educated in a way that would enable them to get those jobs. Ultimately, they were fee-paying schools. So as we said before, we had tuition fees, which obviously paid for facilities. A lot of these public schools were boarding schools, which meant obviously the pupils would have stayed there and would have had dormitories where they would have stayed there overnight and throughout the course of the academic year. We also had a big emphasis on something like the house system, so where we had different houses which would have competed not only in sports, but they would have also congregated together socially for dinner and so on. And part and parcel of public schools, if we stay overnight, for example, is that there was harsh treatment, there was lots of bullying. Okay, before the 1850s, well, across this whole period between the 1800s and 1900s, lots of public schools would have had, in essence, a free-for-all in the evening. The teachers would have gone home, they would have been staying in their exclusive areas or at home in their own public houses, and ultimately the students were left to their own devices. And this obviously created things like harsh punishment and harsh treatment in regards to bullying the younger peers especially. We had extensive facilities, as I spoke about already, in terms of sporting facilities, and there was a big emphasis and a big status of gentry class. So family names would have been popular, and they would have sent their siblings, they would have sent obviously their future generations to these public schools. And ultimately, headmasters were very well respected and fearful figures as well during this period of time. Okay, what we're going to do now is we're going to watch a video clip of the Tom Brown school days. Okay, so as we do that, and as I put the video clip on, try and see if you can describe what sport and public school would have been like during this time.
It's schoolhouse against the rest of the school.
Am I schoolhouse?
Of course you are. Look, just stay behind the goal line with the smaller boys and keep out of trouble. If the ball goes behind the line, touch it down for any other side. Come on, schoolhouse!
Who's that?
Who's that? That's old Brooke, the greatest schoolhouse captain there's ever been. He's come back to hand over to Frobisher before he goes up to Oxford.
Still here, Grant? Flashman! Why aren't you playing?
I turned my ankle, Brookie. It's beastly luck.
Come on, schoolhouse! Stay up! Come on, look lively! Look lively! Boys, good to see you, Johnny. Plucky little youngster, I'll give you that. Victory to Schoolhouse! Victory to Schoolhouse!
Okay, so hopefully you've noticed a few things in regards to that video clip. The first and foremost, obviously it was male dominated, as we said before, but even other things as well. If you talk about the age category, it wasn't, for example, as we have today, under 12s, under 13s, under 14s playing in separate competitions. This was houses playing against each other, where we would have had the older peers and the younger peers coming together. And it was the elders that were the most respected, looked up to. And you could see that as part of that video clip there. And they were seen to be, how can we put it, kind of mentors in a way, prefects that would hopefully aspire and be role models to the youngsters. Okay, so there's a few things there hopefully you could have taken from that, and also the fact, some of this sport would have still been chaotic. Rugby there involved obviously kicking and throwing and running with the ball, but obviously it was still chaotic. So there was rules starting to be developed, but ultimately there were still injuries that would occur as well, and it would have been brutal at times as well. So if we move on from that and we look at the idea of the ethics of sport, when we talk about ethics, we're talking about the beliefs, the values that would have been promoted within these public schools in regards to sport. And it would have been key words such as leadership, fair play, teamwork, courage, respect. All of those things were key core values, okay, and ethics that existed when we thought of public school sport. And it was this idea of supporting character development, developing our personality through sport, and that could be done through integrity. So even if we lost, we win graciously, but we also lose in a manner that was gracious as well. We show sportsmanship where possible. So all of these values really replicated the idea of developing our character through playing sport. Pause the video here, just answer this question. What do these ethics and values look like in sporting examples? So can you give any sporting examples of where we might show honesty, integrity, sportsmanship, leadership, and so on? Okay, so one example you could have come up with is in regards to courage. You saw in the Tom Brown sort of video clip on the last slide there, him taking the courage in regards to picking up the ball and protecting it. Making a tackle against an older boy, that would have been shown as and deemed as high amounts of courage. We could have had other examples involving sportsmanship, so playing within the rules and playing respectfully, shaking someone's hand before and after a game. All of those things would have counted as good examples in sport. So when we look at the word and this phrase in terms of cult of athleticism, we need to know specifically what both of those words mean. So when we refer to a cult, we talk about an obsession, a growing craze in something. That's what we refer to as a cult. Okay, and here we're talking about a cult in regards to playing sport. Okay, so people within these public schools, the students, they were obsessed with sport. They wanted to watch sport, play sport, and they really enjoyed it. And obviously when we think of athleticism, we're talking about this physical endeavour, so putting in as much amount of effort as we can, providing as much moral integrity, and that refers to being honourable, being truthful, showing that good sportsmanship, and we do all of those things through that sphere of sport. Now, you can see on the right-hand side here a picture of Dr. Thomas Arnold, and he was a headmaster of rugby school, okay? And the importance of why I brought him up is because he was a really famous head teacher that really grew into this concept of cult of athleticism, and he really valued that team sports would instill not only discipline in terms of behaviour, but also key characteristics through things like leadership, through code of conduct, so playing fairly but playing within the rules, okay, and that was really important to his ideal within his school. So again, pause the video here. What sport taught you in your own personal life in terms of your own personality? So hopefully you come up with a few ideas there, and I'd like to think that most of you will think that, sport, you look at sport today in terms of being gracious in defeat, so, applauding and congratulating your opponent if they are victorious against you. But a lot of these ideals now are actually being really tested to the limit. With professionalism coming into the game, we're now starting to see people more cheating more, or at least bending the rules more, and that really has an impact on this aspect of whether these ideals within the 1800s are now being broken down due to the fact that we've got that high desire and pressure to win. So, before we finish today's little section in terms of this lesson, and I'll move on to part 2 of the lesson, is we start to think about what are the impacts of the cult of athleticism. And when we think of that, before we think of that, we need to know about these two words, rationalisation and codification. And these are kind of words that are interrelated. And basically what we mean by that, if we have a code in something, okay, or if we rationalize something, then we're basically describing something through a written formal method. Okay, so we record the rules, and here we're talking about terms of recording and writing formal rules within sports. So the public school had a big influence in starting to create those rules. Okay, so part 2 of this lesson will start to look at the impacts and the exportation.